History remembers the headlines. We find the bylines. This is the Unsung. December 1st, 1955. It's a date etched into the American storybook, the day Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama, lighting the fuse for the Montgomery bus boycott. Her quiet act of defiance is legendary, a symbol of courage that schoolchildren learn by heart. But history, as we so often find, is a curated narrative. And in this story, the first draft was torn up. The real first act of defiance didn't happen in December. It happened 9 months earlier, on March 2nd, 1955. On that day, a fiery 15-year-old named Claudette Colvin was dragged off a city bus, handcuffed, arrested, and charged for doing the exact same thing. History chose to credit the carefully selected symbol, but the unsung architect was a brave black teenager who stood up first, who spoke up first, who refused to be moved. So how was a girl in her position, a passionate, dark-skinned student from the wrong side of town, so thoroughly erased from the civil rights narrative she helped ignite? To understand Claudette, you have to understand the world she lived in. Montgomery, Alabama, in 1955 was a city suffocating under the weight of Jim Crow. Segregation wasn't just a law, it was the air people breathed. It dictated where you could eat, drink, walk, and, most pointedly, where you could sit. The city buses were rolling theaters of daily humiliation. Black passengers paid their fare at the front, then had to get off and reboard through the back door. The front 10 seats were permanently reserved for white people. The middle section was a volatile no man's land. Black people could sit there, but only until a white person needed a seat. Then, the entire row had to get up. Not just one person, but the whole row, to avoid any suggestion that a black person and a white person could be seated as equals. Into this world walked Claudette Colvin. She was a junior at Booker T. Washington High School, a bright and outspoken student who paid close attention in her history classes. She was learning about black heroes like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. She was studying the U.S. Constitution, internalizing the promises of liberty and justice it made. For Claudette, segregation wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a deep, personal, and constitutional injustice. She felt it in her bones. On that March afternoon, after a long day at school, she boarded the Highland Gardens bus and sat in the colored section, a few rows behind the designated white seats. As the bus made its stops, the white section filled up. A young white woman was left standing. The driver, Robert Clear, glanced in his rearview mirror and barked, "Give me them seats." A tense silence fell over the bus. 3 other black passengers in Claudette's row reluctantly got up. But Claudette didn't budge. She was thinking about a paper she'd written that day about the local customs that prevented black people from trying on clothes in department stores. She was thinking about Harriet Tubman. She was thinking about the law. The bus driver yelled again, more insistent this time. A black woman sitting behind her pleaded, "You got to move, Claudette." But Claudette simply shook her head and said, "I paid my fare. It's my constitutional right." She was a teenager, but her conviction was absolute. She wasn't just tired, as the story about Rosa Parks would later go. She was indignant. She was armed with knowledge and a profound sense of justice. Her refusal was not a quiet, passive act. It was a declaration. The driver, furious, called the police. 2 officers, Thomas Ward and Paul Headley, boarded the bus. They tried to reason with her, then demanded she move. Claudette again invoked her rights. "It's my constitutional right," she repeated, her voice ringing with the clarity of her conviction. The passengers watched, a mix of fear and awe on their faces. This was not how things were done. You didn't talk back. You didn't quote the Constitution to a white police officer in 1950s Alabama. The officer's patience ran out. They grabbed her, one on each arm. Claudette would later recall one of them kicking her. They manhandled the 15-year-old girl, wrestling her into handcuffs as she screamed that they had no right. They dragged her off the bus and threw her into the back of a squad car, taking her to an adult jail. She was terrified, convinced she was going to be assaulted or killed. All the way to the jail, she just kept praying. Her arrest sent a small shockwave through Montgomery's black community. Civil rights attorney Fred Gray, along with E.D. Nixon, a prominent organizer, immediately saw the potential. Here was a clear-cut case, a direct challenge to the constitutionality of bus segregation. They began raising money for her legal defense. For a moment, It seemed that Claudette Colvin would become the face of the movement. But then, the leaders of the NAACP and other local organizations began to hesitate. The hesitation wasn't about her courage, it was about her image. A few months after her arrest, Claudette became pregnant by an older, married man. In the strategic, high-stakes calculus of the civil rights movement, this was a critical flaw. The leaders worried that she would be seen as unreliable, emotional, or worse, immoral, in the eyes of white America and the media they were trying to influence. They believed the white press would use her pregnancy to discredit the entire movement, painting it as lawless and degenerate. So they made a strategic decision. They needed a more respectable plaintiff, someone unimpeachable. They decided to wait. 9 months later, they found their perfect symbol in Rosa Parks, a middle-aged, lighter-skinned seamstress with a calm demeanor and a well-established reputation in the community. Claudette Colvin's erasure from the popular narrative wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate choice, born from the harsh realities of respectability politics. First, there was age and class bias. At just 15, she was viewed as too young, too impulsive, and too emotional to be a reliable figurehead. Her family was poor, living in King Hill, one of Montgomery's poorest neighborhoods. They lacked the social capital and community standing that Rosa Parks, an officer in the local NAACP chapter, possessed. Then, there was the painful issue of colorism. Claudette was darker-skinned. Rosa Parks was lighter-skinned. In a movement desperate to win sympathy from a hostile white public, leaders believed a lighter-skinned woman would be perceived as less threatening and more relatable. It was a heartbreaking calculation, reflecting the internal as well as external prejudices of the era. The unmarried pregnancy became the final justification for sidelining her. The movement couldn't afford a protagonist who didn't fit the mold of pristine moral character. The legal strategy also played a part. Claudette's charges were complicated. Besides violating the segregation ordinance, she was also charged with assaulting an officer, a claim she always denied. Attorneys wanted a clean case, a simple narrative of a citizen peacefully challenging an unjust law. Rosa Parks provided that. Her arrest was solely for violating the segregation law. And finally, history loves simplicity. A successful movement often needs a single, powerful symbol that everyone can rally behind. Rosa Parks, the quiet, dignified seamstress, became that symbol. Claudette Colvin, the fiery, outspoken teenager, was relegated to a footnote, a casualty of a strategic campaign that prioritized perception over reality. But despite being pushed out of the spotlight, Claudette Colvin's courage was not in vain. Her story didn't end with her arrest or her sidelining. When Fred Gray finally brought the federal lawsuit that would ultimately dismantle bus segregation, he needed plaintiffs. He needed people who had been directly harmed and were willing to testify. One of the 4 women who bravely stepped forward to become a plaintiff in that landmark case, Browder versus Gayle, was Claudette Colvin. It was her powerful, emotional testimony in federal court, describing the humiliation and injustice she felt on that bus, that helped convince the judges. In 1956, the Supreme Court upheld the lower court's ruling in Browder versus Gayle, declaring that bus segregation in Alabama was unconstitutional. Rosa Parks' boycott had brought the economic pressure, but it was Claudette Colvin's court case that delivered the legal death blow. For decades, she lived in relative anonymity, her contribution known only to a handful of historians and activists. But in recent years, there has been a concerted effort to restore her to her rightful place in history. In 2021, at the age of 82, she successfully petitioned an Alabama court to have her juvenile arrest record expunged, finally clearing her name. Claudette's story teaches us a vital lesson. Movements are not built by singular heroes. They are built by many hands, often belonging to people whose names we never learn. People who were deemed too young, too poor, too loud, or too imperfect to be the face of the cause. Her courage reminds us to look beyond the headlines, to find the bylines, and to question which stories we are told, and, more importantly, which ones are left out. Who else in the long struggle for justice has been overlooked because they didn't fit the right image? Share their stories in the comments below. And if you believe in telling the whole story, subscribe to the Unsung.